Hello everybody, we are working on section 4 of the tutorials point tutorial, and it's actually the very first tutorial that you really need to work on in this document. We are assuming the fact that you've had some background knowledge on what ASP.NET MVC is by reading the first few chapters of this tutorial and our regular textbook. The book gives examples showing screenshots from Visual Studio 2015. We are using Visual Studio 2017 in class, and there are some subtle differences which I'll try to point out. So some of the screens you might see in this document might vary slightly from what you have in reality. And it's nothing to freak out about, just be aware of that. Usually Microsoft will still have some way to get to the things that you're looking for if the screens look different. All right, so we're going to begin by opening up Visual Studio. So I'm going to launch Visual Studio here and let it load up. And then I'm going to take this tutorial document, and for right now I'm going to move it off to my second screen. And at times I might pull it back over. It just kind of depends on what's going on. But for right now, it'll be on screen number 2 here. All right, so step 1 in the tutorial is to click File, New Project to get a new project going. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to close the Start page, come up to File, choose New, go to Project, and then we are going to be looking for creating an ASP.NET web application. And we have to be really careful because here's one of those, pull it back over to this screen, scenarios. Notice that in this tutorial document, they show you where to find the template, and I have a high degree of confidence you guys can find this without too much coaching. But notice that the options that are available here are not the same as what I have available in my actual Visual Studio that's on my screen. And the reason for that is with Visual Studio 2017, Microsoft introduced a new set of libraries called the .NET Core libraries, which are intended to be multi-platform, or if you will, cross-platform, and are available on Macintosh and Linux platforms as well. In fact, on those platforms, that's the only library that's available. So it's designed for doing like open source web work. So you do not want to choose Core Web Application. You want to choose the one that says ASP.NET Web Application .NET Framework. And one of the keys that you'll find for knowing it's the right one is the fact that, see where it says MVC right here? That's the one you want. Now, on the left-hand side, if you need to navigate through the tree of options, you have to make sure that you're under Visual C#, that you are in the web section. So make sure that you have that checked and then select this. All right, so they want us to call this first application MVC First App. Now, I'm going to go ahead and throw the title in. I'm going to type MVC First App, and I'm going to name it just the way they show it. Now, here's the little thing I was mentioning before I started recording the video, and that is where they're looking to store this, which can mess you up because Visual Studio has changed their default locations. So notice where they're trying to put it is in my user directory under the source folder in the repos folder. You know what? Not at all where I want it. I do not want my work on a locally stored drive where somebody might come along, grab my laptop and go, and all my work is gone with it. Not a smart plan, folks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put all my stuff inside my OneDrive. Normally I use Google Drive, but I have been having issues with the cloud version working with the live implementation of Visual Studio. There's some syncing issues that happen that prevent some things from working. Last week I created a folder here on my OneDrive called ASP.NET 2-stuff, and that's where I'm going to work. I'm going to put my stuff inside this folder. So I'm selecting this folder to work. And what's going to happen is it's going to create a folder inside that folder that will hold my solution file and then another folder with the whole project. All right, so that's what it's going to be named. In terms of framework, if you're asked, you notice in Visual Studio 2017, the framework that we're using is 4.6.1 by default on my machine. That's relevant to like the version of Visual Studio that you're using and what libraries you have installed on your machine. For the most part, there's no reason to change that at all. If you're using the older version of Visual Studio, this selection was usually found up here at the top. And in Visual Studio 2017, chances are you were probably using 4.5 point something if you're using an older version. I'm going to go ahead and click and say OK. And we're then presented with this second screen. So in terms of where we are in the tutorial right now, we're at the top of page 11 if you're following along. All right, the author wants us to select an empty application, but does want us to select folders and core references for MVC. So instead of having a completely built out project that's got like Bootstrap already thrown in it, we're just using empty up top and selecting MVC here at the bottom. We are not at this point worried about adding unit tests or authentication. We're not being asked to do that, so we're leaving those unchecked. But you can see how easy it is to add them if you want. Not a big deal, just a checkbox. Once you have those selections made, go ahead and click OK. It'll take a few moments to build things out. One thing that you will notice is because we chose empty this time compared to like choosing MVC and doing authentication and adding unit tests, that it still takes a while, but it's a little bit faster because it's not building out as much stuff. Yep, that could be. And hopefully yours is nice and fast that way. All right, so you are seeing now on the right-hand side of Solution Explorer all the folders and content that it built automatically with the project, and it gave you the standard status screen that comes with the project. That does look a little bit different than what you see in the tutorial at the top of page 12, which is this. But they are showing you that basically we do have all the same files and folders available regardless of what the output on the screen is. So we do have a model, view, and controller folder. We have an app start and an app data folder. And then a couple of standard files like the global ASAX file, packages config, and web config. All right. Now, for step number 6, which sits at the very bottom of page 12, they want you to actually go ahead and try to run this application. Now, remember, we created an empty application, so when I hit this play button here, we might expect an error. In fact, the tutorial tells us we're going to get an error if you actually read it. But you can see the output screen at the bottom here goes through the process of trying to build the website and launch it into the browser, which in this case I'm using Google Chrome, and right now it's attempting to do that first launch. Now, the very first launch, usually when you're running Visual Studio's built-in web server, will take a while. It didn't take too long today, but it did take a little while. And you see that it says that there's an error in the application. The resource cannot be found. That is not a mistake because, you know what, we didn't create anything yet. All right, so it did exactly what we asked it to do. But now we're going to get it to do something. So let's go ahead and close this browser window or tab. Come back to Visual Studio, and you notice how by closing that tab, it also shut down the web server automatically. If for some reason it's still running and there's like a red stop button up here, click that red stop button to force it to stop. Because before we can do the next steps, we have to have it not running. In fact, one thing that you might discover, and sometimes I forget myself to turn it off, and you go back to Visual Studio to type in some code, and then you find out, oh wait, I can't. And the reason for that is because the application's currently running, so you can't make alterations to code that's already like active in memory. So at the bottom of page 13, we're going to proceed with the steps to add a controller. So we're going to go over to the controllers folder, and I'm going to right click on that folder. And this is really, the preferred way to do this, believe it or not. Right click on the folder directly, go to the add option in the menu, and then choose the very top item, which we have done. We did this action, remember, last week from the other book, when we're basically following the same steps here. So we're doing a right click, add controller, which will bring up this next interface. And from this interface, we're going to go ahead and choose the top option, which is, once again, an empty controller. It doesn't have anything automatically added to it. Go ahead and click add, and then it will present you with the second screen here, which is going to ask you to name it. I mentioned this last time. Notice that only part of that name is highlighting, because one of the conventions of MVC is every controller is called controller. It has the word controller in it, so we know what it is. So I'm just going to type home for home controller, and then I'm going to click add. Now it's going through a process called scaffolding, where it's building things out. And because we chose an empty MVC scaffold approach, it didn't ask us any subsequent questions like we got last time. We will view those later. When the process is done, it will display the C# file that is the controller file. So when you create a controller, you're not creating any sort of an HTML kind of thing at all. You're creating programming code that will receive whatever action is happening on the web page and then interpret that action from the URL to trigger whatever methods are in this controller and do whatever we specify. Our example today is going to be a pretty simplistic one. We're going to make a really, really simple little tweak in here, kind of like what we did in the other book, and that is basically we're going to change our index method and adjust it so that we can put some text up on the screen. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this from being an action result to being a string. So I'm just going to say string in place of action result. We're keeping the name index. As a result of that, I'm going to change what we are returning, and what we are going to return is a snippet of text, and in the book they say, hello world, you can type whatever message you want, but just make it a complete string, just so you know that it's something you created and not something that was automatically created. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do a Control-S to save, and then I'm going to click on the play button and get this running. And then you see I did get the text up on the screen, and it is just plain text, folks. In fact, one thing you might want to do whenever you work with these dynamic web applications, when you get something up on the screen, it's not a bad idea to do a right-click view source and see what you output. And you know what? What did I output? Plain text. I didn't output HTML. Could I have encoded HTML into this? Well, you know what? Should we try it? Not a big deal. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead, close the browser tabs here, stop the server from running if it doesn't stop automatically, and maybe I could just do something like this. I could say h1, hello world, and then maybe this other stuff could be a paragraph. Did you notice how Visual Studio, when I pressed enter, automatically concatenated it for me? Thank you, Visual Studio. You know, and if you wanted, you could also hard code some style info if you wanted. Something like that. And then you realize that it's breaking. Why is it breaking? Double quotes inside of double quotes. So what do I do? Could I switch them to single quotes? Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm just going to hit run one more time. And now hopefully it will show the slightly revised version with an H1 and some green text for my paragraph. And then if I right click at this point, I will see those HTML tags. And yes, I realize this is not a complete HTML page. That's not the objective here. The objective is to create a simple controller and have it react to what you're doing. Okay. Hopefully everybody got that one to work. Anybody not get that to work? Okay. Go ahead and finish it and make sure that it works. And believe it or not, that wraps up section 4. Just a couple of really quick little key takeaways before we move on to the next section here is I do want you to notice the fact that in your Solution Explorer, when we created the home controller, it automatically created a home view folder for us as well. Now, we didn't generate any views to go with this yet because that folder is empty, because we had our index method here in the home controller automatically generate some text to put up on the screen. But that is something that we will subsequently learn. Also, as I mentioned off video here, which is why I feel compelled to record it now, the home controller is considered one of those default controllers that you might add to most of your projects. And for most typical MVC projects of this sort would be the one that directs you to the home page of the project. It is important to note that you don't have to have a home controller, that you can really have any controller react to any input and direct the user to any page or content that you wish. But home controller is kind of considered a standard. All right, moving on to section number 5. So I'm going to bring the document back over. We are moving on to page number 17. And here we're going to look at a little bit of information first before we go ahead and start coding immediately. But what they're trying to demonstrate here is this concept that an MVC application and the way that a user interacts with it has kind of like this life cycle that goes with it that is helpful to be aware of when you're working with things. So when an application is up and running, and please remember that an ASP.NET MVC application is one that actually, when it runs on a server, runs as compiled code. It really is an application. It is not just static web pages. And because of that, typically it's loaded on the server, the application is started, and then it just waits for users to interact before it ends. But while it's up and running, we will have a variety of users hitting the system and putting in requests. So they will come to our site and then interact with it somehow, and then it's up to us how we react to all of the user interface stuff that they do. So there's a life cycle then for the entire application. So the application, for the most part, should be manually started and stopped if it's running on a server. From the perspective of the user, it will be with their individual interaction, but they always expect that if something is out on the web, that it's always there up and running, right? We just make that assumption. We should know from reality because we, for example, had Blackboard crash a week ago. I don't know how many of you that affected, but it made for a nice weekend because I didn't have to do any grading. You know, that was one benefit. But applications that are online do crash when they have problems with the servers. The ideal, of course, is that they never go down. And that's, in some cases, wishful thinking. So basically, the application lifecycle is If we stop our web server, turn off our server for updates, perhaps that does happen, or if we manually start and stop the application. But in terms of what the user goes through, we consider that what they call the request lifecycle. So we are, and the request being their interaction with the application, requesting information or trying to do something functional. Now, what's interesting about working with this request lifecycle is a lot of it kind of boils down to working with routes. And routing inside of an MVC application is a pretty important thing. What is routing? It is the part of the application that directs whatever the user is doing to things internally within the application that make the things happen that they're hoping for. So like if I log in, you hope your traffic is being routed to the login engine so it can read your password, authenticate that it's you, and actually log you in. You don't care how that happens on the front end as a user as long as it works. But as a programmer, you really do have to care about how that happens. Now, we already saw from one of our examples that authentication can be quite automatic, right? There's systems built in. Why code it when you can just click a few buttons and put it in there? However, there are times when you're coding your own application where you have to decide what's sending what where. That's what routing is all about. So that's what they're attempting to show us here. Now, when we actually get to the point of doing the routing, so you see in section number 5, there's actually no activity to complete aside from listening to me talk about it, which now has ended. So we're moving on to section 6, where we're actually going to do a little bit of the routing work. So the routing inside of an MVC application happens by virtue of one of the framework's libraries, which we see up on the screen there, for system.web.routing. And what's going to happen in a routing setup is that you will see that library being added to some of the C# pages when it's applicable. In addition, you will see code that might look something like this. And you'll notice that some things are registered, and it says register all areas. So there's parts of it that kind of happen automatically. The routes are registered by virtue of the scaffolding that we do. So in other words, we create something inside this environment, and it automatically generates the routes to get there. So we created a home controller before, which is assumed as the home page, and by default takes us to the index method, which is whatever we want it to be for the home page. We didn't create any of that. That route or that setup was done for us automatically. So some things are done automatically. However, they still need to be registered within the application, so when the application receives the data from the user, they know where to go. The subsequent part is that there are manual routes that we create that we have to register, and we actually put that into what they call a routing table in order for that to happen. And that's the reason for the second command, is to do the routing for us. All right. So let's take a look at this code here to get an example of what might happen. Okay, so if you look at this screen here, and I'm going to make it just a little bit larger so it's easier to read. Notice that inside the route config class, where we actually register our routes, we can actually set up a pattern for how we receive the data from the URL and trigger our application. By default, there is a route that's automatically set up within MVC. In fact, this route is typical for all MVC applications that are web-based by default. So if I went to Ruby on Rails, they would have the same type of default route, which would be that following the root of your URL, the thing that follows the first slash is the name of your controller. After the next slash, it's the name of a method. And after that is some sort of parameter being passed to that particular method that you just indicated. And that's why you see controller, action, and ID. And really, you can read it as the controller, the method, and the parameter, or argument, if you will. Sometimes that argument is, if it's numeric, for example, you can just say /5, like we did already. Or if it's in the form of something that's text-based, you might see it in the form of a get, where there's a question mark and then a key value pair that passes it. Either way, same concept. What's interesting about this is you can actually, yes, customize that if you don't like it. So you could change that setup. I don't know why you would, but you could. The idea is, remember folks, convention over configuration. This convention works great, why change it? You can if you want, why change it though? That's my thinking. All right, then notice down here that there's also defaults. So for example, if the controller equals home, the default action is to go to index, and then the parameters are optional. Well, if we had parameters that would trigger something, perhaps. In this case, we don't yet, but the setup is there. So this is how some of the routing works. And this, frankly, it is a very simplistic example, the proof is in the pudding, or like, if you will, in the doing, and you will figure out how it goes from there. Now, whenever you're running your application, and this is kind of an output from what we just did. That's what they're showing up on the screen here. One thing that they're showing is the fact that you're pulling up the URL, and because we're using the internal web server to Visual Studio, it's saying localhost. Okay, and localhost is just a loop back to the local server, and then a colon followed by a port number. Every time you launch Visual Studio and you launch the internal web server, it will create a random port number, usually way up in the port range somewhere, like above 50,000 typically, and use that as the number. So the book says 63,664. That's probably not what mine is. Your machine will pick one at random with every session that you choose. But whatever follows that ending slash are the routes that we're talking about, the ones that take you to the controller, the method, and the parameters that are fed into those methods. So that's the point of that. So some examples. You might have a site where you want to go to the home page. And, when you think of most websites, the home page is like, whatever you have.com/you're done, right? And it takes you to the home page. However, the way an MVC application works is if my routes are set up correctly, I'll go to that root URL, and then what will pop up on the screen would be either this or this, because it took me there. Right? So we're going to the home controller, and we're going to the index view or page or whatever you want to call it. So you can work with that and try it. So in fact, if you go back to what we were just doing here with this really simple little example in the controller, go ahead and launch that again. And we know we have a home controller, right? And as soon as this loads up on the screen, what are we seeing up top here? Well, we're just seeing the straight up URL, right? We're seeing the root URL. It took us and it showed us this. Now, what the book is trying to demonstrate is if I type /home and press enter, I'm in the same spot. If I do home/index, I'm in the same spot. And it works because the root of the application routes me to this spot because of the way the default routes are set up. Controller, method. And that's what the URLs are built on. It just so happens that our root URL so far is pointing to this combination. But notice all three of them work. They're all functionally equivalent. In some cases, you might have a home controller that takes you somewhere completely other than home/index. And then that URL will pop up on the screen if the default routes are set up that way. That's really kind of the point here. All right, I'm going to close the browser, stop the web server from running, and return back to the document. All right. So these are conventions that we use, and highly recommended that you stick with them rather than try to change it. However, if you do get into the situation where you do want to customize it, and there are circumstances in which you want to do that. So for example, if I was writing some sort of an application that was maybe had financial sensitivity to it, for example, as an MVC programmer, I might realize that by showing people what the name of the controller is and showing people what the name of the method is, all of a sudden they have information that they can leverage to kind of mess with my application, right? So an intelligent programmer will recognize these are clean URLs. This might be MVC 5 on ASP.NET. This is okay. Okay, so now I know the name of the controller. Now I know the name of the method. So now I can try my attack. You see the mindset that goes there. So some people will come in here and actually customize the routes to prevent people from being able to understand exactly what those are. So you see the strategy, right? So it's kind of like a security concern of sorts. So if you wanted, you could actually set up a custom route. So in this example, what they're showing is that if you have a controller called process, you could hard code that in and then direct people to particular actions automatically. So in this case, a list that might not be dynamically controlled. Now I know that one's maybe kind of hard to latch onto in terms of example. They show it to you in code here, and they also show you that you can add that to this routes file. And really what you can do over time is if you build a big, rich, complex application, every time you add something that's custom or unique, you can come in here and add the route in and control where everything goes. So yes, you can actually have somebody land on your homepage and take them somewhere completely else and they don't even know it. And you know what? Sometimes it's exactly what you want to do because that's how you keep your application secure. And sometimes not. It just depends. That's one of my favorite little things. But now we're at the point where we should try some of this. So we're at the top of page 24. So we're going to try to work on these particular steps. All right. So go ahead and get the application running. And we're going to put in a request to this route called process. And what you guys, of course, are going to realize is, hold on a second, we didn't code this in, right? So what should happen if I type process at the end of my URL? It should fail. Absolutely. We didn't create this. Why would it go there? Okay. All right, so far we're batting 1,000 here, right? We're doing. Sometimes we intend to fail, and we failed. Brilliant colors here. So what we're going to do to make this work first is create a process controller, and you guys should now, I think, be at least familiar with the basic approach of that. So I'm going to move that off to the second screen. So at the bottom of page 24, step number 2 says, create a process controller by right-clicking the controllers folder in the Solution Explorer, choose Add, and then choose Controller. On page 25, they're instructing us to once again choose Empty. Then you'll click Add. And then on page 26, right at the top, step number 3, it says name it Process Controller. Go ahead and click Add. On the right-hand side of your screen, as you're doing this, you'll notice that it created a new C# file, and it dropped us right into it. By default, it creates an index view for this. And then we're moving on to step number 5, which spans pages 26 and 27. And we're going to, once again, which has been our pattern so far, is to change the action result over to a string. And then just drop in a string here so we know that we're actually hitting the page. And you can say You know what, I'm going to use HTML tags myself. So I'm going to actually put in an H2 here just to have something up on the screen. And I don't know why I can't type a bracket to save my life, but there it is. And say this is the process page, so I know that I got to the right spot. I'm going to close my H2 and then close my double quotes. Go ahead and do a Control S to save, and if you've gotten this far, please relaunch the application, bring it up in the browser, and this time we will add to the URL, and I think there's a typo in the book here that I'm going to point out here in just a second. I'm going to let it launch, and it's of course going to go to the home controller. I'm going to add to the end here process and press enter, and you see I'm on the process page. But I noticed that in the tutorial they say, oops, go to process/list, right? So if I do that, if I add list to the end, what's going to happen? It should fail, because we never added anything for process to our routes for list, right? There's no list method to make it work. So hopefully that's pretty clear. Once again, I'm closing this, and I'm wondering, you know, when I look at these types of tutorials and I'm scrolling back up, if maybe they actually did want us to add this route and they really didn't. Oh, you know, Courtney, kudos. See, my students are sometimes more on the ball than I am. So that's what that's what happens when you don't like fully read it. But on page 27, right at the top, they did actually change this name to list. So if I save that and now run it, of course, guess what? Now it's going to work. And the funny thing is let's actually do this. Let it launch. Let it load. Now if we type process, that will fail. But if we append list, that will work, because we are calling the process controller and the list method. And I'm sorry I didn't see that change. So you know what I'm going to do for next time in the document is I'm going to highlight this just so I don't overlook it. You guys might want to do the same thing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the browser now to stop the server. And we are now up to section 7, which starts to talk about controllers. Now, we played a little bit with controllers already. And this section of the document jumps right in to exercises right away. So we're going to go ahead and we are now going to create a new project. So I want you to be aware of that. We're starting something fresh here. So I'm moving the document off to the right. I'm going back to Visual Studio, and I am going to close my current project by clicking on Close Solution. All right, so close that one out altogether. And then in step 1 on page 28, we are going to do new project. And we're going to make the same choice as last time. We're going to choose Visual C#, Web, and then ASP.NET Web Application with the .NET framework. Once you have those selections made, go ahead and click OK. Oh, wait. Make sure you name it. All right, before you're stuck with Web Application 1 in the folder you don't want. And this one they want called MVC Controller Demo. And I'm still putting it out on my OneDrive and my new ASP.NET 2 Stuff folder. And then I'm clicking OK. On the second screen here, we're going to stick with an empty structure with the MVC folders and references. No other boxes need to be checked. Go ahead and click OK. All right. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to our controllers folder. We're going to right-click it, choose Add, and create a new controller. So this process, I hope, is becoming kind of routine at this point. Once again, we're going to select the empty controller. Go ahead and choose Add. And this one's going to be called Employee. Once you have that typed in, click Add. And then once the scaffolding is complete, it'll drop us right into the C# file for the employee controller. Now we're going to create a custom route so you guys get a feel for how that works. So we're going to go to our app start folder, which is where the routes are defined. And you can see inside that folder how there's a routeconfig.cs file. So go ahead and single click that and bring that up. And then inside here, we need to add a custom route. And what we're going to do is we're just going to take the code that's in the book here, and if you're reading off of it as a PDF, we're just going to, you can copy it, which is what I suggest. And we are going to add that as a separate route here. Now, the default route is already present, so I'm going to add this new route below. And yeah, it pasted in really messy. And you know what? That's not necessarily a bad thing, but we do need to set it up so that it reads correctly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the format of the previous one. So kind of keep it with the comma delimited format here. So you can see basically it's a set of parentheses, there's a semicolon at the end, and each one of the values inside has a comma at the end separating it. Notice also that here we're designating this new route. So the route is going to be called employee, and the action or the method that we're going to be attaching is search, and the parameter component is optional, just like the previous one. So what we're really doing here is we're manually defining the route to this controller. We're saying that if a person types employee, this is where we're going to take them, and then in place of name with the curly brackets around it, whatever methods we have available inside here are available from the URL to the user. And usually, you know, the user's probably not going to type this in manually anyhow. There's going to be doing something on the screen that takes them there, but still the route is defined. Now, if you look at the top of page 32, they show a completed version of the file. They happen to put this route above the default. I put mine below. Does it really matter? Probably not. Just so you have a complete version that you can look at. Now we're going to go back to the employee controller, but first, before I do that, I'm going to do a Control-S to save real quick. And then I'm going to jump back over to the employee controller, which is still open. And then I'm going to do a little bit of adjustment here. And first of all, I'm going to actually delete the index action result. Now the reason for that is, or I guess I could alter it instead of deleting it, is that's what they're asking us to do. What they're saying is there's not going to be an index method here. But what they're going to put in is an action result called search, and then inside the parentheses as a parameter, we're going to put in a string and a variable called name. And then what's going to happen on the inside of these curly brackets, folks, is first of all I'm going to add a line, and we're going to set up a variable called input, which is going to pull in from the server following an HTML encoding the name from the browser. So what that means is this. We are going to be pulling in a string, and whether a person typed it into a form field or it went into the URL somehow, a person's going to be looking for a particular employee. In this, when they're looking for that employee, we'll search for the employee automatically by name because we're feeding it to him. So if a guy's name is like Joe, that'll be appended in there and searched for. Now the return component isn't going to be a view, it's actually going to be content. And what we're going to return is the input, which happens to be the employee. All right. Now this is really kind of silly because what we're really doing here is we're going to go into the browser now, and we're just about at the culmination here of this particular section. We're going into the browser and we're going to type in, once the application's running, employee / a name. And what will happen is that will be sent directly to this spot in this method. It will get stored in that variable after it is stripped clean of any possible like cross-site scripting stuff. That's what the HTML encode does. And then feed it back to the page. So the content on the page is going to be that last parameter in the URL. So if I type, Tom's dog, that's what the page will show because that's what I sent to the browser. So even though it's a simplistic example, it's kind of cool. Let's go ahead and hit the play button, get it to run. Now, we didn't create a home controller here, so do not freak out when this happens on cue. Right? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, there it is. Because we didn't create a home controller. That's totally expected. If you're not comfortable with that, create a home controller. Or create a route that takes you wherever you need to go. But now we're going to drop in our URL. We're just going to say employee, and then following the slash, we're going to give it a name. So here, let's say hi to the web project management people who just came in the room. And I'm going to press enter, and what should happen is it should fail exactly like this. Okay, so what did we do wrong? Let's see if we... All right, so somewhere I messed up my code. So I got an action result, search, string name. So you see how I'm like trying to figure out where I typed in the code incorrectly. My HTML code seems to be all right. And you know what? I'm having this recollection right now that I had the same exact problem last semester too. And you know what? This is a great spot to stop. Here's my challenge for you guys here in the classroom. Figure out what it is. I already know what the fix is. All right, folks, we're running out of time here. I have to start my next class. And we'll fix this problem and then finish also section number 8 next week to complete this assignment. This batch of assignments isn't due right away, so we're still working on Unit 3 for assignments, but Unit 4 will be due the following week. All right, thank you. This video ends here.